When my father died, the church was almost empty. 5 pews at the front, that's all. A few gray-haired veterans in pressed jackets, 2 neighbors sitting politely with folded hands, and me. The silence inside the chapel was heavier than grief itself, the kind that hums in your chest like the leftover echo after a bell stops ringing. Outside, the town kept moving. Cars rolled by. The grocery store 2 blocks away was still running its Memorial Day sale, and somewhere kids were laughing in the park. But here, inside this small wooden church, the man who had fixed 1,000 things for everyone else was being buried with no one left to say thank you. My father's name was Jack Miller. To most people, just Old Jack. A quiet man who wore the same denim jacket year-round, who drove an old Ford pickup that coughed louder than it ran. He wasn't the kind of veteran you'd see in parades. He never stood up when the anthem played, never bragged about the medals that lay hidden in a box beneath his bed. If you asked him about the war, he'd just say, "It was a long time ago." Then he'd go back to fixing whatever was broken, a pipe, a fence, a neighbor's porch step. When I was young, I used to think he was just small. A man who stayed in one town his whole life, who never made much money, who didn't own fancy things. He smelled like gasoline and sawdust. And when I looked at him, I didn't see a hero. I saw someone left behind by time. At his funeral, the priest tried his best. He spoke of faith, of service, of eternal rest. But the words felt too polished for my father, a man who lived rough around the edges. I sat in the front pew, staring at the flag folded neatly on the coffin. It was too clean, too ceremonial. My father's life had been messy, beautiful, but messy. As the service went on, my mind wandered to all the times I judged him. How I used to roll my eyes when he stopped his truck to help someone with a flat tire. How embarrassed I felt when he wore his oil-stained jacket to my high school graduation. How I once told him in the cruel confidence of youth, "You could have been more." He didn't answer then. He just smiled, that small, tired smile of his, the kind that said, "You'll understand someday." And now, sitting there surrounded by empty pews, I hated myself for that memory. After the priest finished, one of the veterans shuffled to the podium. He cleared his throat and said, "Jack wasn't much for words, but he showed up, always." Then he saluted the flag, turned, and left without another sentence. The whole service lasted maybe 20 minutes, 20 minutes to summarize 72 years of a man's life. When the final hymn played, I helped carry the coffin out. The wind outside was sharp, that kind of late May chill that sneaks under your collar. As we lowered him into the ground, I noticed something odd. The cemetery stretched wide and green, dotted with flags beside other veterans' graves. Some had fresh flowers, photos, handwritten notes. My father's plot had only the standard marker and a few plastic carnations the funeral home provided. No family line waiting to pay respects. No stories traded. No old friends with trembling hands touching the stone. Just me. I stood there long after everyone left. The sky had turned a soft gray, the kind that feels like it's holding back tears. The caretaker started folding the chairs. The priest gave me a nod and quietly drove away. That's when the loneliness sank in, not just his, but mine. You grow up thinking your father's world revolves around you. Then one day you realize you were only orbiting his. I knelt beside the grave and pressed my palm against the fresh soil. It was still warm from the sun. I whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." The words cracked as they left my mouth. For years I had seen him as ordinary. But looking at that folded flag, I realized ordinary men don't leave such quiet footprints on so many lives. They just do without expecting applause. And maybe that's why no one came. Because the people he helped didn't even know his name. As I walked back to my car, I saw the town in the distance, small houses, the diner, the hardware store he used to visit every week. Everything looked the same. But somehow it felt different, smaller, emptier. Then halfway down the church steps, I noticed something. On the back pew left behind was a single white envelope. No name, no stamp. Inside, one line written in shaky handwriting. "He fixed my porch in the storm. I never forgot. MT." I stared at it for a long time. That one small note felt heavier than any eulogy. I folded it carefully, slid it into my pocket, and looked up at the sky. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint echo of church bells. And for the first time since the service began, I felt something break open inside me. Not grief exactly, more like recognition. The kind that whispers, "You didn't really know him, but maybe now you will." The morning after the funeral, I woke to the sound of rain on the tin roof. Soft, steady, unhurried, like the world was taking its time to remember something I'd forgotten. I made coffee in the same kitchen where my father used to stand every dawn, boots muddy from whatever project he'd started before sunrise. The house felt too quiet without him. Even the clock ticked softer, as if morning had a volume setting. On the counter sat the envelope I'd found on the church pew. The handwriting, uneven, careful, haunted me. He fixed my porch in the storm. I never forgot. M.T. I didn't know who M.T. was, but for some reason that single line carried more warmth than the entire service had. It made me wonder how many other notes like it were out there, how many tiny stories my father left scattered across this town. I decided to go for a drive. The old Ford truck still smelled faintly of his aftershave, a cheap pine scent that lingered in the cracked vinyl seats. The radio didn't work, and one window refused to roll down, but I kept it anyway. I wanted to hear the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and then settled into a low, steady rumble, almost like his breathing used to sound when he dozed off in his chair. As I rolled through Main Street, people nodded politely but didn't stop. A few lifted their hands in a half-wave, the kind that says, "I recognize you," but not, "I know you." That was my father's town. Everyone knew him, but no one really knew him. I passed the diner where he had breakfast every Thursday, 2 eggs, black coffee, no toast. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside, and a few heads turned. "Morning," the waitress said. Her name tag read Betty. She had the kind eyes that have seen a lifetime of mornings. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please," I said, black like my father used to. She froze for a second, cup halfway in the air. "Jack's boy, right?" I nodded. She poured the coffee slowly. "Your dad was a good man," she said. Then after a pause, "Did you ever hear about the bridge?" I frowned. "What bridge?" "The one out by the river," she said. "That winter when the flood hit, the county trucks couldn't reach the east side. Jack went out with a flashlight and a toolbox, stayed up all night nailing those boards back one by one. My brother was one of the men stuck over there. Said your dad saved them from losing the whole crossing." Her voice softened. "No one wrote about it. He didn't let him. Said it wasn't worth a fuss." I stared into my coffee, the steam blurring my reflection. All these years, and I'd never known. When I left the diner, the rain had eased. The pavement gleamed, black glass streaked with gold where sunlight broke through. I drove out to the river road. The bridge stood there, crooked but holding. Boards of different colors, some newer, some weathered gray. It looked like it had been patched by hand a dozen times, maybe more. I stepped out of the truck and leaned on the railing. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar. Below, the river moved slow and brown, carrying bits of branches downstream. For a moment, I imagined him there, boots planted firm, or in hand, the light from his flashlight trembling against the wind. My chest tightened. How many nights had he been out here doing things no one asked him to do? That afternoon, I stopped by the hardware store. The owner, a stocky man with a beard that looked carved from granite, looked up as I entered. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Jack's boy." "Yeah," I managed. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Your dad still owes me for a dozen bolts and a gallon of paint." Grinned. "But I reckon I owe him for fixing my roof last summer, so let's call it even." I smiled faintly. "He fixed your roof?" "Yeah, during that big storm, remember? I came in the next morning, ladder still up, shingles nailed down, coffee mug left on the windowsill, never said a word about it." He paused, then nodded toward the bulletin board near the door. Taped there, yellowed at the edges, was a photo. A group of volunteers from the town's food drive. My father stood at the edge, half in the shadow, holding a box of canned goods. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes had that quiet focus I'd always mistaken for distance. "He showed up for everyone," the man said softly. "Just never showed off." Driving home, the clouds began to clear. The setting sun turned the town amber, roofs glowing, puddles glinting like coins. Everywhere I looked, I saw pieces of him. A fence he'd mended, a mailbox straightened, a porch light that probably still worked because of his hands. For the first time, I realized how woven he was into the bones of this place. Not as a hero on a plaque, not as a soldier in a parade, but as a quiet rhythm that kept things from falling apart. I parked in front of the house and sat there until the cicadas began their song. In the yard, his workbench leaned against the shed, tools still hanging in neat lines, hammers, wrenches, a coil of rope, everything exactly where he'd left it. I reached into my pocket and took out the letter again. The paper was soft now, edges worn. He fixed my porch in the storm I never forgot. The ink had bled slightly from the humidity, like the words themselves were fading but not gone. I set it on the dashboard beside me and whispered, "Neither will I." Then I sat there in the gathering dark, listening not for engines or wind, but for that quiet hum of life he used to move within. It was faint, almost invisible, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unhear it. That's when it struck me. My father hadn't been forgotten. He'd simply blended so deeply into the town that no one remembered where he ended and it began. And maybe that was the truest kind of remembrance there is. The days after the funeral fell into that strange, hollow rhythm that comes after loss. You move through the motions, make coffee, check the mail, turn on lights, yet nothing feels quite solid. It's as if the world has lost its weight and you're just pretending to live in it. I spent most mornings in my father's workshop behind the house. The shed still smelled of oil, metal shavings, and cedar. Dust floated in the light like small ghosts refusing to leave. Every surface carried a trace of him. A screwdriver mid-turn, a jar of screws sorted by size, a half-finished birdhouse sitting on the bench. He never labeled anything, yet somehow, he always knew where everything belonged. That was my father's way. He could mend a cracked step, patch a roof, rebuild an engine. He just never found a way to fix what was quietly breaking inside him. There was a small radio on the shelf, the kind with a plastic dial and an antenna bent from years of use. When I turned it on, it crackled with static before settling on an old country station. A man's voice sang about home and highways, about promises left behind. The sound filled the space with something raw and familiar. I could almost picture Dad there, humming softly, tapping his fingers on the workbench like a metronome for thought. He always worked in silence. Words for him were tools that dulled with use. But when something broke, a fence, a motor, a neighbor's hope, he came alive. His hands, rough and scarred, seemed to carry an understanding of how things wanted to hold together. I remember once, when I was 10, I brought him a toy truck with a missing wheel. He studied it for a long time, then said, "Everything breaks, son. The trick is knowing what's worth fixing." He glued it back together, stronger than before, but looking back now, I think he was talking about more than toys. On the third day, I found a wooden box tucked beneath the workbench. Inside lay a collection of small items, things that looked ordinary until you held them. A chipped dog tag, a postcard from Vietnam never mailed, a faded photograph of a group of soldiers standing in red dirt, faces sunburned and smiling, and tucked between them, a letter written in my father's neat block handwriting. If you're reading this, I guess I didn't get the chance to explain. I never told you much about the war. I didn't know how. Some things you can't talk about without bringing them back to life. The words blurred as I read them. Not from tears, at least not at first, but from the weight of realizing how much of him I'd never known. He had carried all that pain like another piece of equipment, heavy, silent, always close at hand. Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch with that letter folded in my lap. The sky was turning the color of rust, the kind of evening that bleeds quietly into night. Crickets had started their low chorus in the grass, steady and rhythmic, like the background hum of the town itself. That's when Betty, the waitress from the diner, pulled up in her car. She stepped out holding a paper bag and a small jar of honey. "Thought you could use some company," she said, "and maybe dinner that isn't canned." We sat there eating fried chicken out of the bag, not saying much. She glanced toward the shed. "You know, Jack used to fix things for people who couldn't pay. My neighbor's pipes burst one winter. He showed up before sunrise with a wrench and coffee." I nodded. "Yeah, that sounds like him." She looked at me for a long time before saying, "He never did learn to ask for help, though." Her words lingered after she left. The air had cooled, carrying the faint sweetness of cut grass and motor oil, his scent still clinging to the evening. I leaned back in the chair and thought about how many people my father must have helped, how many nights he spent working while the rest of the town slept. He could fix everything, except the part of himself that believed he wasn't worth being cared for in return. The next morning, I found myself standing by his mirror, the small one in the hallway, cracked in the corner. His comb still lay beside it, a few silver hairs caught between the teeth. I touched the glass, and for a brief second my reflection blurred with his, same jawline, same tired eyes. I wondered what he saw each day before walking out that door. Maybe a man doing his duty. Maybe a man hiding behind usefulness because it was safer than feeling broken. My father didn't talk about emotions, he built around them. He built fences, sheds, bridges, anything that could hold its shape. But when it came to himself, he left the nails loose. That afternoon I went to the town square. The flagpole stood tall in the breeze, ropes clinking softly against the metal. A group of kids were riding their bikes around the fountain. I sat on the bench and watched the world move on, shop doors opening, a bell ringing at the post office, the smell of bread drifting from the bakery. He had touched so many pieces of this place, yet he'd walked through it unseen. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could almost hear him. That steady rhythm of hammer on wood, the low hum of a man keeping the world stitched together by hand. When I opened my eyes, the sunlight had shifted, spilling gold across the square, catching on the window of the diner, the hardware store, the small bridge at the end of Main Street. Everywhere I looked, there was something my father had repaired, something still standing because he refused to let it fall. And yet, standing in the middle of all that, I realized how alone he must have felt, a man surrounded by things that worked except for himself. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint creak of a loose sign swinging over the old barber shop. Without thinking, I smiled. "All right, Dad," I whispered. "I'll tighten that one tomorrow." Then I walked home, hands in my pockets, feeling the warmth of the setting sun against my back. And for the first time, I felt not just his absence, but his quiet presence, still fixing the world one loose nail at a time. By late May, the air had grown heavy, that early summer kind of warmth that made each breath taste faintly of cut grass and sunlight on asphalt. The town was waking up again. Flags sprouted from porches. Shop windows filled with red, white, and blue ribbons. The sound of marching band rehearsals drifted down Main Street like a memory rehearsing itself. Memorial Day was coming. And for the first time since Dad's funeral, I noticed just how much this holiday meant to everyone else. The posters went up first. Annual Veterans Memorial Ceremony, City Park, Monday at 10 a.m. The same park where years ago he used to fix the playground swings when the chains rusted. I stood in front of one of those posters outside the grocery store, a paper bag tucked under my arm. Dad's name wasn't on it. Not in the list of honorees. Not in the small print beneath. Just not there. A strange mix of heat and cold moved through me. Part anger, part disbelief, part something softer, a sadness that didn't know where to settle. I went inside for milk and bread, but my mind stayed outside, circling that poster. Jack Miller, forgotten again. When I got home, I found the answering machine blinking. The light pulsed slow and steady in the dim living room. I pressed play. "Hi, this is Karen from the mayor's office. We'd like to invite you to attend the Memorial Day ceremony on behalf of your father. We'll be honoring the veterans of our town, and we'd love for you to join us." There was a pause, and then her tone brightened artificially. "Please RSVP by Friday. Have a wonderful day." I replayed it twice, each time hearing the same thing. "We'd like to invite you, not we'd like to honor him, just attend." The distinction stung in a way I couldn't explain. That evening, I drove to the park. The sky was the color of brass, and the trees cast long shadows across the grass. A few volunteers were setting up folding chairs near the war memorial, a tall granite slab engraved with names. I walked closer, my hands shoved deep in my pockets. The air smelled faintly of paint and dust where they'd been touching up the lettering. And there it was again, that empty space. No Jack Miller. My chest tightened as I ran my fingers along the cool stone, tracing the grooves of other names. Some I recognized, some I didn't. But all of them had stories. So did he. The difference was, his stories had never been told out loud. A man in a city employee vest noticed me lingering. "You family?" he asked, friendly enough. "Yeah," I said. "Jack Miller." He frowned, searching the list. Don't think that one's up here." "He fought," I said quietly, "served overseas." The man gave a sympathetic nod. "Paperwork thing, maybe. Some names didn't get transferred when we redid the memorial last year. Happens sometimes." He said it kindly, but the words landed like gravel in my throat. On the way home, I stopped by the diner again. Betty was refilling sugar jars at the counter. "They left him off," I said, sliding onto the stool. She looked up, brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "His name on the memorial not there." Betty sighed, setting the jar down. "He never wanted it there. I remember the committee asking years ago. He told them to save the space for someone who needed it more." I blinked. "He said that?" She nodded. "Said he'd done his part, didn't want any fuss." The war took enough attention, he told me. Let peace have the rest. The words hit me square in the chest. It sounded exactly like him, humble to the point of invisibility. I rubbed my temples. Still, they could have said something, invited him, a thank you at least. Betty gave me that look, soft, knowing. He didn't live for thank yous, but maybe you could go, be there for him. Her suggestion sat with me the whole drive home. The night before the ceremony, I went through his closet. His uniform hung at the back, pressed and faded, smelling faintly of mothballs and time. I held it against my chest, the fabric rough under my fingers. The medals on the pocket were tarnished, but each one caught a glint of light like they were trying to speak. I imagined him in it again, standing straight-backed, hat tilted just right, quiet pride in his eyes that he never let turn into arrogance. I laid the uniform across my bed and sat beside it for a long while, unsure if I felt closer to him or farther away. Morning came wrapped in sunlight and brass band echoes. When I reached the park, the crowd had already gathered, families, school kids waving flags, veterans in caps and jackets. The mayor was shaking hands, smiling too wide for the cameras. When she spotted me, she came over. "Mr. Miller, we're so glad you could make it. Your father meant a great deal to this town." Her words were polished, but I could hear the hollowness beneath. Still, I smiled politely. "He'd have liked that," I said. As the ceremony began, I stood near the back, away from the stage. The sun was hot on the back of my neck. The speeches rolled on about bravery, sacrifice, freedom, and I kept thinking how my father had lived all those things quietly without a microphone. When the final salute echoed through the park, I closed my eyes. Somewhere, a trumpet played taps. The notes hung in the air like breath that didn't want to leave. And for a moment, standing there among strangers clapping for other names, I realized something I hadn't before. It wasn't that the town had forgotten him. It was that he'd chosen to be the kind of man who didn't need remembering. Still, as the crowd began to disperse, I couldn't help whispering into the hum of voices and footsteps. "You deserved a seat in the front row, Dad." The wind moved through the flags, making them ripple and sigh, and in that sound, for just a second, I thought I heard him answer. The sun sat high and merciless above the town square that morning, bleaching the flags into pale ghosts of red and blue. The Memorial Day ceremony had drawn nearly everyone, families in folding chairs, veterans standing stiffly in pressed uniforms, and children fidgeting with paper flags that fluttered in their hands. I stood near the back, beneath the shade of an oak tree that creaked softly in the wind. From there, I could see the stage, podium draped in bunting, microphones catching the light, and the mayor waiting behind them with a smile too practiced to be real. She was the kind of politician who always looked like she'd rehearsed her empathy in front of a mirror. Next to her stood a man I recognized from billboards, Gary Sutton, local developer, the one who'd revitalized half the town and charged the other half out of it. He wore a navy suit that looked too expensive for a day meant for remembrance. When the band stopped playing and the chatter quieted, the mayor stepped up to the microphone. Her voice rang through the speakers, warm, polished, coated with just enough solemnity to sound respectful. "Good morning, friends, neighbors, and fellow citizens. Today, we gather to honor those who gave everything, not for reward, not for recognition, but for love of country and community." Applause rippled politely through the crowd. The air smelled faintly of sunscreen and fresh-cut grass. I folded my arms, my heart already tight. This was supposed to be about them, the soldiers who came home and those who didn't. But something about the stage, the cameras, the way the mayor glanced toward the local news crew, told me it was going to turn into something else. She continued, each word measured like it had been polished overnight. "Over the years, our town has been blessed by men and women who served not only on the battlefield, but right here at home, people who built, repaired, and cared for this community." My chest lifted slightly. Maybe she'd say his name. Maybe, just maybe, they hadn't forgotten after all. She smiled, gesturing toward the man beside her. And few have embodied that spirit more than our very own Gary Sutton, whose generous donations have rebuilt our Veterans Center and restored our historic downtown. The applause came louder this time, almost eager. Cameras clicked. A drone buzzed overhead. I stared at the stage, numb. Sutton nodded humbly, pressing his hand to his chest like he was pledging allegiance to himself. I wanted to walk away. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I stood there and listened as the mayor went on about his service to the community, his vision for the future, his commitment to those who served. Her words blurred together, melting into a kind of civic poetry that sounded right but meant nothing. Then she began reading names, the veterans whose lives they were honoring that day. The list moved slowly, each name punctuated by a small silence, each silence carrying its own small weight. I waited and waited, and when she reached the end of the list I knew, no Jack Miller. The mayor lowered her notes and smiled again. We thank these heroes and all who have served, known and unknown. May their legacy remind us to live with purpose, gratitude, and unity. The band began to play again, the brass horns bright and triumphant. But I didn't hear it that way. To me, it sounded hollow, like a song written for the living, not the remembered. When the crowd stood for the closing salute, I felt a pressure building in my chest. My throat burned. All around me, people clapped, took photos, hugged veterans, and laughed about the barbecue they'd head to next. That's when I saw the empty chair in the front row, the one marked reserved, in memory of our fallen. The fabric caught the sunlight, glowing briefly like a quiet signal in the chaos. I thought of him, my father, sitting there alone years ago, watching other men receive medals, listening to speeches that were meant for people just like him, yet somehow never about him. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of gunpowder from the ceremonial rifles fired in salute. The sound cracked through the air, 3 shots, sharp and final. The echo rolled over the crowd and disappeared into the hills. I didn't clap. I couldn't. Instead, I looked up at the sky, where a flock of starlings broke apart and reformed, shifting, aligning, finding their place again. I wondered if souls did that too, if maybe the forgotten ones found each other somewhere the rest of us couldn't see. The ceremony ended and the crowd began to scatter. People moved in clusters, laughter, handshakes, the scrape of folding chairs. I stayed behind, walking slowly toward the memorial wall. The granite was warm beneath my palm. I traced the lines of names again, the grooves filled with gold paint, all the men who had been remembered properly. And somewhere behind those names, unseen, lived my father's story, the quiet man who never stood on a stage, who never shook a mayor's hand, who believed that service didn't need a microphone. I felt anger then, sharp and sudden, not just at the mayor or the developer, but at myself, for never standing up when he was alive, for letting the world treat his silence like absence. Park had nearly emptied when I turned away from the wall. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, was sitting near the chairs, waving a small flag. He looked up at me and grinned, gap-toothed and earnest. "Mister," he said, "did you know any of the heroes?" I swallowed. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I knew one." He nodded solemnly, the way kids do when they think they understand something big. "Was he brave?" I smiled faintly. "Braver than anyone you'll ever see on that stage." The boy's mother called him and he ran off, flag fluttering behind him. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the sun settle lower, the air turning soft around me. And though the ceremony was over, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the truest speeches are the ones never spoken aloud. When the applause faded and the brass band packed away their instruments, the sound that lingered wasn't music. It was the dull hum of irritation rising in my chest. The crowd was still buzzing with conversation. Kids chased each other around the chairs, men clapped one another on the back, women gathered in clusters with paper cups of lemonade. The smell of grilled meat drifted from a nearby vendor, and laughter scattered across the park like debris after a storm. But I couldn't hear any of it clearly. My ears were ringing, not from the rifles but from the pounding pulse of anger that had nowhere to go. I walked past the folding chairs, past the banners and balloons, past the mayor shaking hands with Gary Sutton for the 3rd time that morning. Every step I took felt like I was grinding gravel beneath my shoes. I didn't belong there. He didn't belong forgotten there. The words she'd spoken, those practiced lines about service and community, played over and over in my head. They sounded emptier now, like an echo shouted into a hollow place. I wanted to grab the microphone and tell them the truth. Tell them about the man who rebuilt bridges with his own hands, who repaired neighbors' homes when storms ripped through town, who never asked for thanks because gratitude embarrassed him. But instead, they honored a man who bought his legacy with donations and camera crews. The injustice burned in me, hot, steady, unforgiving. I found myself at the edge of the park, near the old oak trees that bordered the river. The shade was cool, and the sound of the current softened the noise of the crowd behind me. I leaned against the railing, fists clenched, jaw tight. My reflection trembled in the muddy water below, the face of a man who looked too much like the one I'd just buried. I wanted to shout, to break something, to make someone see what they had done, or what they hadn't done. Instead, I pulled at the collar of my shirt and breathed hard through my nose. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and charcoal smoke. Somewhere nearby, a small bell rang, the church tower marking noon. Its calm rhythm only made the heat in my chest worse. I thought of Dad again, sitting in this same park years ago, probably smiling at the noise of kids, fixing something no one else noticed was broken. I pictured his hands, his steady way of working, his silence. And for the first time, I hated that silence. He could have spoken up. He could have told them his story, claimed his place. But he didn't. He never did. He stayed quiet his whole life, and now his name had disappeared along with him. I kicked at a rock, watching it tumble into the river. The splash broke the surface, then vanished instantly, the water smoothing itself over like nothing had happened. That's what anger felt like, sharp, loud, then swallowed whole. A familiar voice startled me. "Hey, you all right?" I turned. It was Betty, still in her waitress uniform, a to-go cup in her hand. She'd come straight from the diner. I said flatly. She followed my gaze toward the stage where the mayor was posing for photos. "Yeah," she said softly. I heard her speech. "Not much room in there for your dad, huh?" "No," I said, my voice cracking on the word. "Not even his name." Betty nodded, her face drawn. "That's how he wanted it, remember, no spotlight." "I know," I said, sharper than I meant to. "But he deserved one." The bitterness spilled out before I could stop it. "You know what's funny? They thanked Gary Sutton for donating bricks. My father laid them." Betty sighed. "You're not wrong." I rubbed my temples. The anger was changing shape now, less like fire, more like a weight pressing behind my eyes. She touched my arm gently. He never needed a crowd to know what he was worth. I stared at her hand, weathered, kind, still holding traces of flour and coffee. Maybe he didn't, but I do. I needed them to know. She didn't argue. She just looked at me the way you look at someone who's still finding the edges of their grief. When she left, I stayed by the river a long time. The afternoon light softened, the heat breaking into patches of shadow and gold. I could hear cicadas beginning their slow, electric song in the trees. I picked up a twig and tossed it into the current, watching it drift downstream until it was just another ripple among many. I thought about what it meant to be remembered. Maybe memory wasn't a list of names on a wall. Maybe it was quieter than that, in the swing he'd repaired, in the houses still standing because of his hands, in the strangers who carried a kindness they didn't realize they'd learned from him. Still, that didn't stop the ache. I wanted the world to say his name out loud, just once, where everyone could hear it. I wanted proof that he mattered. As the crowd began to leave, I saw a man carrying a folded flag to his car, his medals glinting in the sun. The sight of it twisted something inside me. I turned away, unable to watch anymore, and started walking toward the parking lot. The gravel crunched under my shoes, rhythmic, hollow. Each step sounded like a small argument with the earth. When I reached the truck, I rested my hand on the hood, the metal hot beneath my palm. "Dad," I whispered, "why didn't you let them see you?" The wind stirred through the trees, dry and whispering like a voice too faint to catch. I wanted to believe he answered me. But all I heard was the sigh of leaves and the distant clatter of chairs being stacked, the sound of a ceremony already moving on. I got in the truck and slammed the door harder than I needed to. The steering wheel was slick against my hands, and for a moment I thought I might actually scream. But I didn't. I just sat there, breathing in the scent of old leather and dust, until the anger dulled into something heavier, a quiet, stubborn ache that refused to fade. Then I turned the key and the truck shuddered awake, coughing like it shared my exhaustion. The engine's rumble filled the silence, steady and alive. It was the same sound I'd grown up with, the rhythm of his life. And somehow it made me angrier still, that even gone, he could calm the storm he'd left inside me. I didn't go straight home after the ceremony. I drove without knowing where I was headed, the truck rattling over the cracked back roads that wound through the edge of town. The afternoon sun was harsh, too bright for how hollow I felt. Each mile hummed beneath the tires like a question I couldn't answer. By the time I stopped, the light had softened, slanting through the trees in long amber streaks. I found myself outside the old community center, the one my father used to repair every summer when the gutters sagged or the roof leaked. The parking lot was empty except for a few stray leaves tumbling in lazy circles. I killed the engine and the silence settled heavy around me. That's when I saw her. An older woman stood by the steps, holding a bouquet of daisies wrapped in newspaper. Her gray hair was pinned back, her posture a little bent but deliberate, like someone carrying something fragile. When she noticed me, she smiled faintly, that gentle kind of smile people use when they already know who you are. "You're Jack's boy," she said, not asking. I nodded. "Yeah, you knew him. Everybody knew your father," she said, adjusting the flowers. "Some just didn't realize it." Her voice had that warm, rasping tone of age, not frail but lived in. She handed me one of the daisies. The stem was cool between my fingers. "I was hoping to leave these by the center door," she continued. "He fixed it after the flood years ago, spent 3 nights here with a flashlight and a mop, never let us pay him." I swallowed hard. That sounds like him. She studied me for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed, edges yellowed, handwriting neat but shaky. "He asked me to give this to you someday," she said. I blinked. "To me? When?" Her eyes softened. "He said I'd know when the time was right. I think maybe today is that day." She pressed the envelope into my hand and gave a short nod, like her task was done. Then she turned and walked toward the end of the street, the daisies bobbing slightly as she went. I stood there, the paper warm from her hand, my pulse beating against it. I didn't open it right away. Something about the weight of it, small as it was, made me feel like I was holding a pulse, something still alive. I walked around the building, past the windows streaked with dust, until I reached the back steps that overlooked the river. The air was cooler there, scented with pine and faintly metallic from the water. I sat down on the step, the wood creaking beneath me, and turned the envelope over. My name was written across the front, Daniel, in his clean, deliberate handwriting. The same letters that once signed permission slips, grocery lists, and the occasional birthday card that always came late but never empty of thought. My fingers hesitated at the seal. For a moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was inside. Maybe it was an apology, maybe an explanation, maybe nothing that could make up for the silence he'd left behind. Still, I opened it. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper, worn soft at the edges. I unfolded it carefully, and his handwriting greeted me again, a voice made visible. "Son, if you're reading this, I'm not around to tell you things the way I should have. I was never good at talking. I could build you a shed out of scraps, but I couldn't build a sentence worth keeping. So I'll try to make this one count." My throat tightened. I read on. "You used to ask me why I spent so much time fixing things for other people. I never answered right. The truth is, fixing kept me steady. It made the world quiet. When I hammered a nail or turned a wrench, everything else, the noise in my head, the memories, fell away. Maybe that wasn't the best way to live, but it's how I stayed standing. I know I wasn't the father you needed all the time. I worked too much. I kept too many things inside. But I hope when you think of me, you remember the good parts, the steady parts. The way a beam holds a roof without asking for credit. That's what I wanted to be for you." I had to stop reading for a moment. The words blurred, and I pressed the page against my knee to steady it. The river moved slowly below, reflecting pieces of sunset between the trees. "Don't worry about how people remember me, son. They don't need to. I already got what I wanted, you. A roof over our heads, a small town that still stands. That's enough for one life. But if you ever feel like you're fading, like the world forgets you, do something kind and tell no one. That's how you stay alive in the places that don't have names on them. Love, Dad." I folded the letter slowly, as if it might crumble if I breathed too hard. The paper smelled faintly of his workshop, that mix of wood oil and dust. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the water slide over the rocks. The anger I'd been carrying since the ceremony cracked open a little, letting something else seep in, sorrow, maybe, or understanding. The last light of day turned the surface of the river gold, then amber, then deep gray. When I looked up, the first stars had begun to show. I slipped the letter back into the envelope and held it against my chest. The breeze lifted the edges of the paper, whispering around it like breath. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed once, slow, soft. Final. I stood, feeling heavier and lighter all at once. And as I walked toward the truck, the envelope pressed over my heart, I realized that maybe, just maybe, my father had never really been silent at all. He'd just been waiting for me to listen. The next morning, the letter was still on my kitchen table, beside a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold. I'd read it 3 times before the sun even cleared the maple trees. Each time the words felt different, heavier yet somehow gentler too. Dad's handwriting lingered in my mind like a voice carried by wind. If you ever feel like you're fading, do something kind and tell no one. But now I needed to do the opposite. Now I needed to find the stories he never told. I started with the name written on the envelope the woman had given me, M.T. The initials kept tugging at me like a puzzle half solved. I drove to the library first, figuring that in a town this small, everyone's stories crossed paths eventually. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman who'd been there since the Carter administration, looked up as soon as I stepped in. "Looking for something?" she asked. "Someone," I said. "Initials M.T. may be connected to my father, Jack Miller." Her expression softened. "Jack, yes, I remember him fixing the front steps here once. Didn't even ask for payment." She thought for a moment, tapping her chin. "Could be Margaret Thompson. She lives out by the old railway line, lost her husband years ago. Jack helped her with her roof after that tornado." That was enough for me. The road out to the Thompson place was narrow, lined with wildflowers and the faint shimmer of heat. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive, white paint flaking at the edges, wind chimes whispering on the porch. Margaret opened the door before I even knocked. She was older now, her hair soft and silver, her eyes bright as river stones. "I knew you'd come eventually," she said, smiling like it wasn't strange at all. She led me inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. Photos lined the mantel, children, grandchildren, a younger couple standing in front of a house that had clearly seen storms. "I don't know what you've heard," she said, lowering herself into a chair, "but your father saved my life." I blinked. "He what?" She nodded, hands folded. "It was years ago. After my husband died, I couldn't keep up with the place. The storm that year tore the roof clean off the kitchen. I tried to fix it myself and the ladder gave out. Jack was driving by, must have seen the lights. He caught me halfway down before I hit the ground, broke 2 ribs himself doing it." I sat there, speechless. "He never told you?" she asked. I shook my head. Margaret smiled sadly. "He spent 3 nights here patching that roof. Said he didn't want me to feel like a burden. I tried to pay him, of course. He left the money on the porch rail and drove off before sunrise." Her voice trembled slightly. "He wouldn't even take breakfast." For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the wind chimes outside. When I finally stood to leave, she pressed something into my hand, a photograph, creased and faded. It showed my father standing on that same roof, hammer in hand, face half-shadowed, smiling faintly toward the camera. "He told me not to tell anyone," she said, eyes shining. "But I think he'd forgive me now." I drove back into town with that photo on the seat beside me, sunlight flickering over it as the road curved through the trees. The more I looked at his face, the more I saw something I'd missed my whole life, not pride, not duty, but a quiet kind of relief, as if helping others was the only thing that ever let him breathe easily. At a red light, a teenage boy tapped on my window. He wore a service vest from the grocery store and held out a small envelope. "You're Mr. Miller's son, right?" I nodded, startled. "Yeah." He smiled awkwardly. "My grandma told me to give you this. She said your dad used to drive her to the clinic every week, even after his own appointments." I took the envelope. Inside was a thank you card, old and yellowed, with a note scrawled inside. "Jack, you're the only reason I can still see my doctor. Don't think I don't notice the gas money you never take. Ruth." I sat there long after the light turned green, cars honking behind me. My father's kindness was everywhere, hidden in plain sight, scattered across lives like seeds no one thought to trace. By evening I was back at the diner. The sky outside was melting into shades of coral and smoke. Betty poured me coffee without asking, the smell of it warm and bitter. "You've been busy," she said. I told her about Margaret, about the card, about the photograph. Betty smiled, shaking her head. "That man, he had more stories than this whole town combined, just kept them folded up neat and quiet." I glanced at the window. The neon sign outside buzzed softly, its reflection trembling in my cup. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" She looked at me kindly. "Because he didn't let us. Said if folks started talking, it'd stop being about the work and start being about him." Something inside me gave way, a small crack but deep. I wish he'd trusted us enough to see how much it mattered. Betty reached across the counter, her hand resting over mine. "Maybe he did, Daniel. Maybe that's why he left the trail. so you'd find it when you were ready. I looked down at our hands, hers warm, steady, mine trembling slightly. The photo peeked out of my jacket pocket, the edges curling. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint clatter of dishes, the smell of frying onions, it all seemed sharper somehow, as if the whole world was conspiring to remind me he'd been here the whole time. When I left, the sky was dark and full of stars. The town was quiet, almost reverent. As I walked toward the truck, I realized I wasn't just following his story anymore. I was living inside it, one hidden act of kindness at a time, each one whispering the same truth he'd written in that letter, that real legacies don't stand in sunlight. They shine quietly, through the lives they've repaired. 2 days after visiting Margaret Thompson, I was still carrying the photo of my father in my jacket pocket. The edges had begun to curl, worn from being handled too often. Every time I looked at it, something inside me shifted, a quiet awareness that my father's life had been far larger than I'd ever understood. That morning, the town was drenched in late summer heat. The air felt heavy enough to drink, and the cicadas droned in the trees like 1,000 clocks ticking at once. I stopped at the gas station on Main Street, partly to fill up, partly because I didn't know what else to do with myself. As I paid, a boy at the counter, no older than 16, freckles across his nose, name tag readingly, stared at me a little too long. "Hey," he said hesitantly, "you're Jack Miller's son, right?" I nodded, half smiling. "Yeah, you knew him." He brightened. "Kinda, my dad did. We've got something that might belong to you." I frowned. "To me." He disappeared into the back room before I could answer. A few minutes later, he returned holding a dusty VHS tape in a cracked plastic case. Someone had written Flood Relief 2003 on the label in black marker. "My dad used to work for the volunteer crew that summer," Illy explained. "He said your father showed up every day for a week, even after the trucks left. When we moved, he found this in the basement and figured maybe you'd want it." He handed it over carefully as though it were made of glass. At home, I had to dig out my old VCR from the attic, wiping away years of dust before connecting it to the small TV in the living room. When I slid the tape in, the screen blinked blue, then static, then an image began to form. A shaky camera view, rain-soaked streets, water rising against storefront doors, the kind of chaos that makes everything look slower, heavier. A man's voice narrated off-camera. "We're standing at the corner of 5th and Monroe. Most of the volunteers left last night, but a few stayed behind." The lens tilted, and there he was, my father, standing knee-deep in muddy water, his jacket plastered to his back, face streaked with dirt. He was holding a rope tied around a floating crate, guiding it toward a stranded woman and her child perched on the hood of a car. I leaned closer to the screen, barely breathing. He moved with quiet precision. No shouting, no panic, just that same deliberate calm I'd seen 1,000 times in his workshop. He tied off the rope, lifted the girl first, then the mother, pushing them through waist-high water toward a pickup truck waiting on dry ground. When he turned back to the camera just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something I'd never seen before, not pride, not exhaustion, but an unguarded tenderness. A softness that said this wasn't about duty. It was about care. The camera shook again, zooming out to show the rest of the street. Power lines hung low, houses half flooded, the air thick with the smell of diesel and wet earth. My father waded back for another crate, ignoring the rain that lashed across his face. "That guy's been here since dawn," the man filming said. "He keeps saying he's no one important, just helping till it's done." I paused the tape. The frozen image of him filled the screen, shoulders squared, rope in hand, the river swirling around his legs. It hit me then, how absurd it was that I'd spent years resenting his quiet. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was focus. It was devotion without audience. I pressed play again. The video cut to another angle, nighttime now, floodlights glaring off the water. A small group of men worked together, shoveling debris, repairing a bridge railing. My father was there again, hammering boards into place while others shouted directions. He wasn't leading, wasn't following, just doing. Then, the camera panned to the side where a young boy, maybe 8 years old, was handing out bottled water to the workers. He looked up at my father and said something too faint to catch. My father leaned down, said something back, then patted the boy's shoulder. The boy grinned, the kind of grin that stays with you for life. I felt my throat close up. The tape ended abruptly, the screen fading to static, the hum of the machine filling the room. I sat there in the blue light, hands trembling just slightly, watching the flicker until it hurt my eyes. Then I rewound it and watched again. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, the tick of the wall clock, the occasional creak of old wood shifting in the humidity, the hum of the refrigerator like a faint heartbeat. I went outside, barefoot, the ground still warm beneath my feet. The stars were scattered bright and uneven above the dark stretch of the yard. I thought about that little girl from the video, the mother, the boy with the water bottles. How many of them still lived here, never realizing they'd crossed paths with him. The flood had come and gone. The water had receded. But my father, he had stayed behind, invisible among the ruins, fixing what he could until no one needed him anymore. I realized that maybe the town hadn't erased him. Maybe he'd simply dissolved into it. The tape, the photo, the letters, the stories, they weren't fragments of his life. They were pieces of a pattern, a map I was only now learning to read. I sat on the porch steps until dawn, the first light turning the world pale and forgiving. The tape rested beside me, rewound and ready, as if it too wanted to be seen again. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel angry or lost, just small, and strangely at peace, knowing that my father's quiet life had made more noise than any speech ever could. I found the medal by accident. It was a Tuesday morning, pale light slipping through the blinds, dust swirling lazily in the air like something searching for a place to land. I had been sorting through the old chest at the foot of his bed, the one that creaked like it resented being opened. Most of it was what you'd expect. Work shirts folded neatly, a box of screws, an old wristwatch frozen at 3:47. But beneath it all, wrapped in a piece of brown cloth, was a small wooden case. It was heavier than it looked. Inside lay a medal, tarnished but unmistakably a medal of honor. The ribbon was faded, the metal dulled, yet its weight felt alive in my palm. He had refused the ceremony decades ago, asking that the paperwork stay sealed at the state archive. Only a handful of men from his unit ever knew. My breath caught. I stared at it, trying to understand how something like this had been hidden here all these years. He never mentioned it. Not once. I took it out to the porch where the morning air was cool and sharp with the scent of wet earth. The weight of the metal seemed to pulse in my hand, as though holding a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I sat there for a long time, replaying every moment I could remember, every time I'd asked him about the war and he'd changed the subject. Every time he'd gone still when fireworks cracked through the sky on the 4th of July. He wasn't avoiding the past, he was protecting himself from it. Still, I needed to know. That afternoon I drove to the Veterans Hall on the edge of town. The building was old, brick faded to rust, the flag outside lifting in slow, tired movements. Inside it smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. At the reception desk sat a man in a blue jacket with a silver pin on the lapel. His name tag read Warren. His eyes flicked to the metal case in my hands before I even spoke. "Jack Miller's boy?" he asked. It startled me. "You knew him?" Warren smiled sadly. "Knew him? Hell, everyone in this place owed him something." He gestured for me to sit. The vinyl chair squeaked under me. "I found this," I said quietly, setting the case on the desk. "He never told me." Warren nodded slowly. "No, he wouldn't have." He took off his glasses, rubbed them on his sleeve, and sighed. "You know how he got that?" I shook my head. "It was during a convoy in '71, he began. "They got ambushed outside Da Nang. Most of the unit went down fast. Your father dragged 3 men out under fire, one of them was me." The words hung there, soft but immovable. "He took a bullet through the shoulder that night," Warren continued, voice roughening. "Didn't tell the medics till the rest of us were safe. When they tried to pin the medal on him, he refused the ceremony. Said he didn't want to stand in front of cameras while the men who didn't make it couldn't." My throat tightened. "He never said a word." "He didn't have to," Warren said. "He carried those men with him every day. That's why he stayed quiet. It wasn't humility, it was guilt." I sat back, the air feeling thinner. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a metronome for memories. Warren leaned forward. "You know, every Memorial Day he came here early, not for the speeches. He'd clean the plaques, said he owed them that much. Then he'd leave before anyone arrived." I imagined it, him on his knees in the early light, cloth in one hand, the other resting on cool metal engraved with names. Only he still whispered. "Your father," Warren said, "was the kind of man who believed remembering wasn't something you did out loud." When I drove home, the medal lay on the seat beside me, glinting faintly with every turn of light. I couldn't stop looking at it, that small, silent proof of everything I hadn't known. At a red light, I thought about all the years I'd misunderstood him, how I'd mistaken quiet for distance, how I'd taken his stillness for lack of pride. But pride had never been the point. Survival had been, and carrying the weight of others, that had been his way of saying he loved them, even when it broke him a little more each day. At home, I set the medal on the kitchen table and stared at it until the edges blurred. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Then, without thinking, I took one of his old mugs from the cabinet, filled it with black coffee, and placed it beside the medal. A small, ordinary tribute, but it felt right. I imagined him there across from me, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around his cup. The silence wouldn't feel awkward anymore. I reached for the letter he'd written me, the one I'd nearly memorized by now, and read the line that had once confused me. Fixing kept me steady. It made the world quiet. Now I understood. The quiet wasn't about peace. It was about control, about keeping the ghosts at a volume he could survive. The world had called him a hero once. He just couldn't bear to live like one. That night I went back out to the porch. The sky was deep indigo, the crickets loud and restless. I held the medal up toward the moonlight. The ribbon caught the silver glow, its worn threads trembling slightly in the wind. For the first time I didn't see it as an award. I saw it as a confession. A small, silent admission that my father had given more than he could ever say, and that the cost of bravery was sometimes a lifetime of quiet. I closed the case gently and whispered into the dark, "I hear you now, Dad." And for a fleeting second the air felt lighter, as if he'd been waiting for me to finally understand the language he'd been speaking all along, the kind made not of words but of the spaces between them. It began with a restlessness I couldn't shake. After finding the medal, after hearing Warren's story, silence no longer felt sacred, it felt wrong. My father had carried his quiet like armor, but maybe now it was my turn to make some noise on his behalf. For weeks, the medal sat in its case on the mantel, catching the morning light and returning it faintly, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Every time I passed it, I felt the same thought surface again and again: they need to know. Not just about the medal, about him. The town hall stood on the corner of Jefferson and Elm, a squat brick building that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. The same hall where Dad had once patched the leaking roof for free. That night, when I stepped inside, the meeting was already in progress. Folding chairs filled the room, lined up in neat, nervous rows. Ceiling fans clicked overhead, stirring warm air that smelled faintly of coffee and ink. At the front, the mayor stood behind the lectern, her voice carrying that same glossy certainty I remembered from Memorial Day. "Next on the agenda," she said, "we'll discuss the proposed renovation of the Veterans Memorial Plaza." Her tone was polite, detached, the kind people use when they're talking about something that doesn't truly belong to them. I sat in the back, my pulse thudding against the wooden chair. Around me, the townspeople murmured talk of funding, of permits, of landscaping, words that circled the point without ever touching it. Finally, I stood. My voice came out rougher than I expected. "Before you talk about redesigning the memorial," I said, "I think you should know there's a name missing from it." The room quieted. The mayor blinked, hand still resting on her clipboard. "Excuse me, Jack Miller," I said. "You left him off." All eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of it, dozens of strangers suddenly aware of the man I'd spent my whole life trying to understand. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Wasn't he that mechanic out by the river road?" "Yes," I said, "and a veteran, a decorated one." The mayor adjusted her glasses. "I wasn't aware Mr. Miller had been recognized for." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the medal case. The light caught the medal just enough to hush the room again. "He didn't want recognition," I said, my voice steadier now. "But that doesn't mean he didn't deserve it." The fans kept turning above us, blades slicing the silence into slow, heavy beats. I told them what I'd learned, the convoy, the rescue, the wounds he'd hidden. I spoke about the flood, the roof he rebuilt, the lives he'd mended quietly, one by one. Every sentence felt like setting down a stone I'd been carrying for years. By the time I finished, no one moved. Even the mayor's usual poise had softened. "Mr. Miller," she said finally, "if what you're saying is true, then our memorial does him a disservice." "It's true," came a voice from the back. Everyone turned. It was Warren, the veteran from the hall, his silver pin glinting under the fluorescent lights. He made his way to the front, leaning on a cane that clicked softly with each step. "I was there," he said, his tone flat but certain. "That man saved my life. He never took credit, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't give it." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Then, from the second row, Batty, still in her diner uniform, stood and crossed her arms. "And who do you think fixed half the homes after that flood 10 years ago? That memorial wouldn't exist if Jack hadn't patched the roof on this building first." Laughter broke the tension, quick and honest. One by one, voices began to rise, small stories at first, then louder ones. "He repaired my fence when my husband was sick. He taught my son how to change a tire. He plowed our driveway all winter, never asked a dime." The mayor looked stunned, eyes sweeping across the room as if seeing her town for the first time. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The story was telling itself now, gathering its own rhythm. When the room finally settled, the mayor cleared her throat. "I think it's clear," she said quietly, "that this community owes Mr. Miller more than a name on a wall. We owe him a day." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Warren leaned on his cane. "I say we dedicate the new plaza to him, not just his service in uniform, but the one he gave after, the kind that kept this town standing." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then certain. It wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind of applause that carries gratitude in its palms. The mayor nodded. "Then it's decided. The rededication will take place on Memorial Day. We'll rededicate the Veterans Plaza in honor of Jack Miller." The words hit me like wind. For a moment I couldn't move. I looked down at the medal in my hand, the metal catching the faintest trace of warmth from the overhead light. I imagined him somewhere beyond that ceiling, half smiling, shaking his head, probably muttering, "I told you not to make a fuss." But I smiled anyway. When the meeting ended, people lingered, neighbors I barely knew, each wanting to tell me a small story of their own. I listened to everyone. Some were simple, some almost unbelievable, but all had the same heartbeat running through them. The quiet hero no one noticed until he was gone. As I stepped out into the night, the air was cool, laced with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The streetlights hummed softly, moths circling their glow. For the first time I felt something lift, not the grief exactly, but the weight of unfinished truth. The town finally knew his name, and I finally knew why he'd never spoken it himself. He hadn't needed to. He'd left it written in everyone else's stories, waiting for the day they'd learn to read them aloud. By the time the last light slipped behind the hills, the town had gone quiet in that way only small towns do, the kind of hush that feels like everyone is holding their breath together. It was the night before the new Memorial Day ceremony, the night my father's name would finally stand where it belonged. Main Street was half-lit, strings of white bulbs hanging from the lampposts, swaying gently in the warm breeze. The air carried a mix of scents, fresh paint, cut grass, and the faint tang of fireworks waiting somewhere in their boxes. I walked through the square with my jacket slung over my shoulder, passing groups of volunteers, still working under portable lights. They were setting up folding chairs, polishing the memorial wall, arranging the wreaths that would line the plaza by morning. Someone had repainted the flagpole, its base still smelling faintly of turpentine. A boy no older than 16 was brushing off the marble tiles with a towel too small for the job, his hands streaked with white dust. When he saw me, he grinned. "Hey, Mr. Miller, we're almost done. The mayor said the new plaque comes in the morning delivery." I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. "Looks great, kid. He'd have liked this." He tilted his head, confused. "Your dad?" "Yeah," I said. "He liked things that stayed standing." The boy smiled, not fully understanding, but he didn't need to. He went back to scrubbing, humming under his breath. The diner stayed open late that night, its neon sign buzzing low against the dark. Betty stood behind the counter with her sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee for the handful of people still out working. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" she said when I sat down. I shook my head. "Feels strange, like the whole town's awake for him." She slid me a mug. "In a way it is." The coffee was hot and bitter, grounding. The sound of the spoon against the cup, a slow, steady clink, filled the silence between us. "Warren came by earlier," she said after a moment. "Dropped off a box of old photos. Said he's speaking tomorrow. Wants you to see them first." She handed me the box. It was worn, taped at the corners, the smell of old paper rising as I opened it. Inside were black and white snapshots, men in uniforms, laughter frozen mid-motion, boots caked in mud. And there, near the bottom, was one of my father. Younger, leaner, eyes squinting into sunlight. He was sitting on a sandbag wall with his arm slung over another soldier's shoulder, both smiling as if they hadn't yet learned what it meant to lose. I traced the edge of the photo with my thumb. "He looks lighter," I said softly. Betty nodded. "He carried what they couldn't. Some people do that without ever saying it." Her voice caught on the last word and she turned to wipe down the counter that didn't need cleaning. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the diner's windows. Somewhere in the distance, a flag cracked sharply in the air. When I left, the square was nearly empty. Only the hum of the generator remained, its low vibration blending with the rhythm of crickets in the grass. A few men from the Veterans Hall were finishing the final touches on the stage. Warren stood among them, his cane leaning against a folding chair. He waved when he saw me. "Daniel, come here, son." I walked over, the gravel crunching under my boots. He gestured toward the wall. A new sheet of tarp hung over part of it, pinned at the corners. The paint beneath was still drying, faint streaks of moisture glinting under the floodlight. "Plaque's coming at dawn," he said. "Mayor wants to unveil it after the anthem. You'll be up there too." I started to protest, but he raised his hand. "Don't argue. It's not for the cameras, it's for him. He'd want you to stand there." I looked at the covered wall, the shadow of his name hidden beneath it, and my stomach tightened. "I'm not sure I can," I said quietly. Warren's voice softened. "You already are, son, just by being here." He clapped my shoulder gently and turned back to his crew, leaving me alone with the night. I walked down to the river. The water moved slow and dark, reflecting the lights from town in thin, wavering lines. The same river he'd waded into during the flood, the one that still carried his footprints somewhere beneath its silt. The air was cooler here, laced with the faint scent of algae and damp earth. I sat on the bank and pulled the medal from my pocket, the one I hadn't yet shown anyone. Its edges gleamed softly, catching moonlight like it remembered fire. For a long while I just held it. The cool metal against my palm steadied me, the way his hand on my shoulder used to. Above me, a barn owl crossed the night sky, silent as thought. A train horn sounded far away, low and mournful, echoing off the hills. I thought of all the stories I'd heard in the last few weeks, the people he'd helped, the things he'd built, the quiet way he'd saved lives without needing to claim them. I whispered into the stillness, "They'll know tomorrow, Dad, I promise." The water rippled, soft and deliberate, as if something unseen had just agreed. When I finally rose to leave, the town was asleep again. The lights over the memorial flickered, then went dark, leaving the square bathed in moonlight. I passed the covered wall one last time and rested my hand against the tarp. The paint was cool beneath it, still faintly tacky. "Tomorrow," I said, "you'll get your place." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain and the far-off hum of thunder rolling somewhere beyond the hills. I looked up, the clouds gathering slow and heavy, and for a heartbeat it felt like he was standing beside me, silent as always, but no longer unseen. Then I turned toward home, the medal in my hand catching one last glint of light before the darkness folded around it. Morning broke soft and gray, the kind of light that seems to hesitate before touching the world. A thin mist hung over the town square, blurring the edges of everything, the rows of folding chairs, the flagpole, the polished stone of the memorial wall still draped beneath a white tarp. People arrived early, moving quietly as if stepping into a church. You could hear the shuffle of shoes on damp pavement, the low hum of conversation, the clink of metal chairs being unfolded. Somewhere a trumpet was being tuned, the notes cutting through the air like clear glass. I stood off to the side near the stage, my hands stuffed into my jacket pockets. The metal was there, cool against my fingertips, its weight a steady heartbeat against my skin. The mayor moved through the crowd, shaking hands, her smile polite but subdued this time. Warren was already seated near the front, cane propped beside him, eyes closed as if he was praying or remembering. Betty waved to me from the diner's catering table where she'd laid out coffee and biscuits for the volunteers. Her apron fluttered in the wind like a flag of its own. And then the bell from the church tower struck 10. The ceremony began. The mayor stepped to the podium. Her voice was quieter than usual, her words less polished. "Today," she said, "we honor the lives that built this town, not just with uniforms and medals, but with work, with kindness, with the kind of service that leaves no headlines, only the quiet mark of something good done well." She paused, and the microphone crackled softly. "This year we rededicate this memorial to one of our own, A man who served his country and his community not for recognition but because it was in his nature to fix what was broken. A man whose silence spoke louder than any speech ever could. She looked toward me. "Mr. Miller, would you join us?" The crowd turned. My legs felt wooden as I walked up the steps. The boards beneath me creaked in rhythm with my heartbeat. When I reached the podium, she stepped aside. Someone in the crowd coughed. Somewhere a flag snapped in the wind. I looked out at the faces, familiar yet changed. These were the people he'd helped without ever telling me. The widow with the repaired roof, the mechanic whose tools Dad had replaced after the fire, the boy from the gas station holding a flag too big for his hands. The microphone waited. My throat was dry. "I used to think my father was just quiet," I began. My voice sounded foreign in the speakers. But I was wrong. He wasn't quiet, he was listening to everyone all the time. A few heads nodded. The air felt heavy but not sad, more like something sacred settling into place. "He didn't talk about what he'd done," I continued, "because for him, doing was the talking. When a bridge needed fixing, he fixed it. When a family needed help, he showed up. When the town flooded, he didn't wait for orders, he just waded in." The words came easier now, like the years of silence were finally breaking open. "I found his medal," I said softly. "I found letters from people he helped. I even found a video of him pulling strangers out of the floodwaters. All of it hidden away, not because he was ashamed, but because he thought the world didn't need to see. But I think he was wrong about that." The mayor stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Let's show them," she whispered. She nodded toward the large screen beside the stage. The crowd turned. The video flickered to life, grainy, unsteady footage from that day years ago. My father appeared waist-deep in brown water, hauling a crate toward a trapped woman and her child. The sound of rushing rain filled the speakers, mixing with the collective breath of the audience. Someone gasped. Someone else began to cry quietly. In the footage, he turned once toward the camera, face streaked with mud, eyes fierce and focused. He looked almost right at me across time. Then the image froze there mid-frame. For a moment no one moved. Then softly a voice broke the silence. It was Warren. "That's him," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "That's the man who saved my life twice." The crowd turned toward him. He lifted his cane in salute, and as if on cue, others began to rise, one by one, in silence until nearly the whole square was standing. The mayor wiped at her eyes. "I think," she said, "it's time we gave him his place." She stepped to the memorial wall and reached for the rope tied to the tarp. With a slow pull, the fabric fell away. There it was, the new bronze plaque, letters freshly carved, catching the sunlight as the clouds broke overhead. "Jack Miller, veteran, neighbor, friend. He fixed more than things. He fixed U.S." A collective sigh moved through the crowd, part relief, part gratitude. The wind caught the flags, and the sound of them unfurling filled the square like an exhale from the earth itself. I stepped forward and set the medal at the base of the plaque. The metal clinked softly against the stone, a small sound, but it carried farther than I expected. Then the trumpet began to play taps. The notes rose and fell, clear and aching, curling through the air like smoke. I closed my eyes and let it fill me, that sound both ending and beginning all at once. When the last note faded, there was silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels full, like a room holding its breath in reverence. Someone began to clap, slowly at first, then stronger until the whole crowd joined in. It wasn't loud, but it was certain, the kind of applause that feels like a prayer answered. And for the first time since he'd gone, I didn't feel like I was standing alone. I looked at the plaque again, at the sunlight spilling over his name, and whispered so only he could hear. "They know now, Dad, you're home." The breeze shifted, brushing my face with the faint scent of cedar and rain, the scent of his workshop, of every morning he'd left before dawn to help someone else's day begin. And in that breath of air, warm and fleeting, I could almost hear his quiet laugh, the one that always came right before he said, "It's fixed." After the ceremony ended, no one moved for a while. People lingered in small clusters around the memorial, as if leaving would somehow break the spell that had settled over the square. The sky had cleared completely, the light sharp and clean, the kind of blue that feels too wide for a small town. The mayor spoke quietly with reporters, Warren shook hands with old friends, and Betty handed out cups of lemonade from a cooler, her smile both proud and wet around the edges. I stood a few feet from the plaque, still staring at his name, the metal now warm under the sunlight. The metal I'd placed beneath it glinted softly at my feet, catching in the corner of my vision like something alive. Then, out of the corner of the crowd, a figure approached, a young soldier in dress uniform, cap tucked neatly under his arm. His posture was sharp, but his eyes carried the fatigue of someone who'd seen too much too early. He stopped in front of me and saluted. "Sir, the VFW asked me to deliver this," he said. He reached into a canvas satchel and carefully withdrew a folded American flag, pressed crisp and perfect, the blue triangle facing up, its white stars bright against the fabric. The same kind of flag they give to families at military funerals. I hesitated before taking it, my throat tightening around the air. "For him." The young man nodded. "They said it was long overdue." He handed it to me with both hands, the gesture formal and deliberate. Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "My father served under him. Said your dad taught him more about honor than any commander he ever had." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, afraid that if I spoke, my voice would crack open. The soldier saluted again and walked away, his boots clicking in even rhythm until they faded into the distance. I stood there holding the flag, the fabric warm from his hands, the smell of starch and faint tobacco clinging to it. The folds were so precise they almost looked unreal, a geometry of memory and discipline. Later, as the crowd thinned and the stage was dismantled, I sat alone on the steps of the memorial, the flag across my knees. The town had returned to its soft, familiar hum, car doors closing, laughter drifting from the diner, the faint chime of the church bell marking noon. I unfolded one corner of the flag just enough to touch the fabric inside, smooth, dense, heavy with meaning. It felt alive, and for the first time since all this began, I cried, not out of grief but out of recognition. I cried because this flag, this folded triangle of stars, wasn't just a symbol of his service. It was the sum of everything he never said aloud. Every nail he'd hammered into someone's porch. Every night he'd worked under floodlights while others slept. Every "it's fine" he'd spoken instead of "I'm hurting." He had carried his silence the way soldiers carry gear, tightly packed, efficiently arranged, heavy but necessary. And somehow that silence had built a life for everyone around him. As the afternoon stretched on, the sun began to sink, painting the town in shades of bronze and long shadow. Betty came by, her apron now untied, her hair frizzing in the humidity. "You should keep that," she said, nodding toward the flag. "Or maybe put it somewhere he'd see it." I managed a small smile. "He'd probably tell me to leave it where people could trip over it." She chuckled softly, sitting down beside me. "Yeah, that sounds like him. Always humble, always impossible." For a few minutes we just sat there watching the sunlight crawl across the square. Children rode bicycles around the fountain. Someone's radio played faintly from an open truck window, an old country song my father used to hum when fixing the porch rail. Betty leaned back, sighing. "You did good, Daniel. You gave him what he never asked for but always deserved." Her words settled into me like something final but gentle. When she left, I stayed until the light began to fade again, the kind of twilight that turns every reflection gold. I took the folded flag and carried it back to the truck. At home, the house felt different, not emptier but rearranged somehow, like the air itself had shifted to make space for something new. I walked into his workshop, flicked on the single hanging bulb and let the familiar smell wash over me. Oil, cedar, dust, and time. The birdhouse he'd never finished still sat on the bench, half painted, a brush stiffened with dried color beside it. I set the flag on the shelf above his tools. It looked almost out of place, this perfect symbol sitting among rusted nails, jars of screws, and a radio still tuned to static. But then I realized it fit. It belonged. Because this, the tools, the worn wood, the smell of work, was his real battlefield. I ran my hand across the flag one last time, the fabric soft under my fingertips. "Dad," I whispered, "they finally gave you this." The bulb flickered once, briefly dimming, then steadied again. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was his way of saying it's enough. Outside, the night came slow and full, stars spilling across the dark in careless brilliance. I stepped onto the porch, listening, the faint whistle of wind through the trees, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves brushing the roof. It wasn't silence anymore. It was presence, the kind that fills the space between heartbeats. The flag rested quietly in the workshop behind me, folded and waiting like a promise that no longer needed to be kept, only remembered. And in the stillness of that night I felt it clearly, deep and certain. His quiet voice carried not through words, but through every steady thing he ever left behind. The house was quiet again. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore, it breathes. Outside, the evening light was thinning, sliding across the walls in soft bands of gold. Dust hung in the air like tiny suspended memories, drifting lazily in the glow. I sat at his old desk, the one pushed up against the window overlooking the yard. His chair still creaked the same way when I leaned back, a sound that used to annoy me but now felt like a heartbeat I didn't want to lose. On the desk sat the folded flag, a pen, and a single sheet of stationery, thick, off-white, the kind he used when writing grocery lists that somehow looked like blueprints. For days I'd felt something building in me, a pressure that words might finally release. Not for the world, not even for the town that now spoke his name with reverence. This one was just for him. I uncapped the pen, took a slow breath, and began. Dad, I don't know if letters work where you are. I don't know if words can travel that far. But I figure if silence could carry your love all these years, maybe words can carry mine now. The first lines came easier than I thought. I paused, watching the ink settle into the page like veins. They finally did it. They put your name on the wall. They even gave me a flag, the one you should have gotten long ago. I can't tell if you'd be proud or just roll your eyes and say, too much fuss. Probably both. I smiled, just barely. Asterisk Warren told them what you did in Vietnam. Betty told them what you did here. And I told them about the flood, the people, the nights you stayed awake so others could sleep. For the first time, Dad, they all saw what I see now, that your silence wasn't emptiness. It was a kind of language. A way of building peace, one quiet act at a time. Asterisk. I leaned back, the chair groaning beneath me. Outside, a breeze rustled through the maple leaves, their shadows trembling against the window pane. The air smelled faintly of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Asterisk, you used to tell me everything breaks eventually. I never realized you meant people too. You fixed what you could, fences, roofs, engines, but when it came to yourself, you just kept working until you ran out of parts. I used to resent you for that. Thought you were hiding from me, from us, but now I understand. You weren't running. You were carrying things you couldn't put down. Asterisk. The ink smudged slightly under my thumb. I let it. Imperfection felt right. Asterisk, that day they unveiled your name. The whole town stood up for you. Even the mayor cried, though she tried to hide it behind her speech. I laid your medal at the base of the plaque, the one you hid away all those years. It caught the light, just for a second, like it was breathing again. Asterisk. My hand hesitated before writing the next line. You know what I realized? You never needed that medal, but I did. The truth sat heavy on the page. I let it stay there unedited, the way truth should be. The room had grown dimmer, the sky outside now a muted violet. I turned on the small desk lamp. Its shade dented, the pull chain clicking faintly like a whisper each time it moved. Asterisk, I keep thinking about that letter you left me, the one you wrote but never meant for me to find until you were gone. You said, if you ever feel like you're fading, do something kind and tell no one. Well, I've been trying, Dad. I fixed Mrs. Lanning's porch step last week. Didn't charge her. I even fixed the latch on the church gate, though I didn't tell Pastor Jim. You'd have liked that one. Asterisk. I paused again, a laugh slipping out softly, surprising myself. It echoed briefly through the room, that small human sound reminding me that grief could live beside joy without breaking either. You should see the shop now. I cleaned it up, well, mostly. The birdhouse you never finished is still on the bench. I think I'll leave it that way. Some things deserve to stay halfway done. Proof that you were here. Proof that you were still building. My eyes blurred for a second and I blinked hard to clear them. The paper shimmered slightly under the lamplight. Asterisk, you once told me the trick isn't fixing everything. It's knowing what's worth fixing. I think I finally get it. It wasn't about wood or metal or engines. It was about people, about this place. About love, the kind that doesn't announce itself but just shows up with a wrench and a quiet heart. Asterisk. The pen began to tremble slightly in my hand. I set it down, exhaled, and read what I'd written. Asterisk, I guess what I'm trying to say is thank you for all the things you said without saying, for the things you fixed without being asked, for teaching me that sometimes the loudest kind of love is the quietest one. Asterisk. I signed my name, simple and small, Daniel. When I folded the letter, I placed it inside an old envelope and wrote nothing on the front. Then I carried it out to the workshop, the night air cool against my face. The flag sat on the shelf, the metal tools gleaming faintly under the single hanging bulb. I slipped the envelope beneath the folded fabric, tucking it there like a secret meant for only him. For a long moment I stood in the doorway watching the dust shift in the light. The world outside hummed softly, a cricket's rhythm, the low whistle of wind, the faint clink of something metal settling. It was the sound of life continuing, imperfect, unhurried, quietly whole. And somewhere in that stillness I could almost hear him again. His slow, steady voice cutting through memory like a beam of light through dust. "Everything breaks, son. The trick is knowing what's worth fixing." I smiled, closed the door behind me, and let the silence carry the rest. The summer after the ceremony was the gentlest one I can remember. Not because of the weather, though the days were warm and generous, but because something inside the town had shifted. The story of Jack Miller had spread far beyond the square. At first, it was just talk at the diner, the regulars telling newcomers about the man who'd fixed their fences, or who'd repaired a neighbor's porch before the snow came, or who'd shown up unasked with tools and quiet kindness. Then the local paper ran a piece, the hero who never wanted to be one. After that, people started coming from other towns, even other states, just to see the plaque. But what struck me most wasn't how many came to see, it was how many came to help. By late June, the community center had more volunteers than it had tasks. Teenagers painted fences, veterans mended the park benches, and old men repaired mailboxes that hadn't needed fixing in years. The air carried the scent of sawdust, coffee, and laughter, that kind of laughter that comes easy when people work side by side, hands busy, hearts quiet. Someone started calling it Jack's Week, and somehow it stuck. Every summer, on the week before Memorial Day, the town would stop what it was doing and spend 7 days fixing, cleaning, repairing for one another. No cameras, no speeches, no press, just hammers, paint, and stories told over fences. I remember one morning that first year. A group of kids stood by the bridge, the same bridge my father had rebuilt long ago. The wooden planks were worn but still solid. They were repainting the railings red and white. One of them, a girl with a messy braid and paint on her cheek, looked up as I passed. "Hey, Mr. Miller," she said. "Is it true your dad fixed this bridge by himself?" I stopped, smiling faintly. Not by himself. The town helped. They just didn't know it yet. She nodded thoughtfully, then said, "That's kind of what we're doing now, huh?" "Yeah," I said, "that's exactly what you're doing." The wind lifted the smell of fresh paint, and for a moment I could almost see him there, sleeves rolled up, eyes steady, quietly content to let others finish what he'd started. Over time, I began to notice something I hadn't before. The town itself looked different. Not cleaner, not newer, but more alive. There was pride in the small things. The way the shop windows gleamed in morning light, the way the church bells rang sharper, the way people stopped to talk a little longer in the street. It wasn't about the repairs. It was about the remembering. Every act of kindness became a thread, weaving the town together tighter than before. And in those threads I saw him everywhere. Not as a ghost, not as a monument, but as a quiet rhythm pulsing through ordinary lives. One evening, near the end of that first Jack's Week, I walked down to the memorial. The sun was low, the sky brushed with orange and violet, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly eternal. The bronze plaque glowed softly in the fading light. Someone, maybe one of the school kids, had left a small jar of wildflowers at its base, and next to it lay something new, a folded piece of paper taped carefully to the stone. The handwriting was small and unsure. "Dear Mr. Miller, I never met you, but I fixed the swings at the park today. Mom said you'd like that." I read it twice, my chest tightening in that strange mix of pride and ache. That's when I realized the town wasn't just remembering him, it was becoming him. Years passed, but the ritual grew stronger. Every Memorial Day, families gathered early in the square. There were fewer speeches now, fewer words really, mostly just music and work and laughter. People would bring stories, too, stories of kindnesses no one knew about, of small miracles that had quietly kept the world turning. A farmer who left eggs on porches during hard winters. A teacher who bought shoes for kids who came to school barefoot. A mechanic who stayed after hours fixing cars for free. Each story would begin the same way. He reminded me of Jack. And each time I'd smile because that was the point. One night, many years later, I sat on the same porch where I'd once opened his letter, where I'd once wrestled with the weight of what I hadn't understood. The yard was still, except for the hum of crickets and the soft buzz of the porch light. I held a mug of coffee in one hand and watched the lights from Main Street flicker in the distance. Across the road, the town kids were laughing, carrying buckets of paint, brushes, and a ladder. They were headed to the bridge again. Tomorrow would be another Jack's week. I felt something stir in my chest, a quiet pride that didn't need applause. I thought of the words he'd left me. If you ever feel like you're fading, do something kind and tell no one. And suddenly I understood something deeper than before. It wasn't just a rule for living. It was a way of keeping the world repaired. Because maybe we don't all get monuments. Maybe we're not all remembered by name. But if each of us fixes one small thing, a fence, a friendship, a forgotten dream, then maybe we keep the world standing a little longer. That's what he taught me. That's what this town learned. The quiet ones, the helpers, the people who build and mend without being seen, they are the spine of every place worth living in. They don't ask for thanks. They just keep going. And maybe, in a way, that's the truest form of immortality. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and cut grass. Somewhere down the road, a flag snapped in the night air, crisp, certain, alive. I looked up at the stars, bright, uncountable, spilling across the sky like a promise. And I whispered softly, "You did it, Dad, you fixed us." The breeze brushed against my face, warm and familiar, and I swear for a moment I heard the faint creak of his old chair, that same rhythm he used to make when he'd lean back after finishing a long day's work. A sound not of ending but of rest. And that, my friends, is the story of the town that remembered. It's not just about a father or a veteran. It's about what happens when one person's quiet goodness becomes the blueprint for an entire community. It's about how you, listening right now, can change a world you might think is too big to notice you. Because maybe you can't fix everything, but you can fix something. A broken chair, a tired friend, a piece of yourself that stopped believing kindness matters. And if each of us does that, just one small act, no credit, no noise, then maybe together we keep the world from falling apart. That's the legacy of Jack Miller. Not a medal, not a monument, but a movement. One quiet fix at a time. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your father, your mother, or someone who shaped your life without ever asking for thanks, please take a moment to share it. Leave a comment with the name of someone who fixed you in their own quiet way. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories that heal, stories that remind us what family, community, and love truly mean, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep building this little corner of kindness together. Thank you for listening, my friends. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. And may your homes and your hearts always stay fixed.